On one side of the continuum is specificity, and the other side of the continuum is adaptation or development. So specificity gets you very, very, very good at that specific task, but it often compromises adaptation and development. Yeah, you could do a 1 rep max every single day and you would get tremendously strong, but that's only going to last for 6 months, a year, 6 years, at some point where you're going to be able to say, like, we're no longer developing or building infrastructure, we're only optimizing what we have, and that inherently is going to limit our potential adaptation.
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
This podcast is brought to you by HitUni.com. HitUni.com are a provider of amazing online courses for high-intensity training qualifications. HitUni comes highly recommended by the best in the field, including Body by Science co-author Dr. Doug McGuff, Discover Strength CEO Luke Carlson, and trainer and founder of Bay.com, Drew Bay. It was founded by my friend, author, and longtime personal trainer Simon Shawcross, who's also been a guest on the podcast. Simon has 15 years experience training clients and has supervised over 15,000 high-intensity training workouts. Using knowledge from experts like Skylar Tanner, Dr. James Steele, Dr. Ellington Darden, HitUni is a goldmine for learning everything to do with high-intensity training. The courses are delivered online through the website, where you can learn via a variety of multimedia materials at your own pace. There's online support and a discussion forum where you can share ideas and ask for help. To learn more about high-intensity training and improve my own results, I started their personal trainer course. The content is amazing, the courses are really easy to follow, and each section is organized into bite-sized chunks that give you a real sense of achievement after you complete each one. I should also mention there is a DIY course. So this is the course for you if you're not necessarily a personal trainer, but you want to learn more about high-intensity training and how to implement it for maximum benefit in your own exercise regime. To get your exclusive Corporate Warrior 10% discount on any course you purchase, simply head on over to hituni.com, that's HITUNI.com, and enter the coupon code CW10, that's CW and the number 10. So again, head on over to hituni.com, pick your course, and enter the coupon code CW10 for 10% discount. Thank you for your support. Hi guys, I am Lawrence Neal and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior. I'm coming at you after recording a marathon of new podcasts over the last few days. I decided to redesign my Project Kratos inspired workout after talking to Drew Bay with a new B routine. How very exciting. This podcast teaches you how to optimize your high intensity training protocol and your high intensity training business to help you achieve your health, fitness and business goals. I've interviewed many of the top experts in high-intensity training and HIIT business and related fields, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Skylar Tanner, Drew Bay, Brad Schoenfeld, Tim Ryan, Ted Naiman, Bill DeSimone, and many, many more. My next guest is Dr. Andy Galpin, who has a degree in exercise science, a master's in human movement sciences, and needing to know more about muscle, Andy spent another 4 years studying the structure and function of human skeletal muscle at the single cell level, which earned him a PhD in human bioenergetics in 2011. This resulted in the opening of the Biochemistry and Molecular Exercise Physiology Lab, otherwise known as BMEP or BMEP, at CSU Fullerton. The BMEP lab studies the acute responses and chronic adaptations of human skeletal muscle in response to high force, velocity, power, and fatiguing exercise from the whole body, down to the individual muscle fiber and even the individual DNA. Side note, they even had Conor McGregor in fairly recently, I believe, to measure how he is able to generate so much force and power in specific moves. The team does this by taking muscle biopsies from non-athletes and elite athletes from different backgrounds. For example, normal college student, MMA fighter, boxer, weightlifter, etc. And they use highly sophisticated laboratory techniques and equipment to address questions about single fiber type, size, function, protein quantity, diameter, mitochondria, and myonuclear function. So goes to say that Andy and his team are probably some of the top experts on the planet with regard to muscle fiber types. I really enjoyed Andy's interview on Joe Rogan recently, which was what led me to ask him onto my show. And every now and again, I like to invite someone on the show who doesn't come from a HIIT background and maybe a bit opposed to high intensity training, and who generally has a different opinion on what exercise is most effective for various outcomes. And whilst Andy does believe that high intensity training does provide some value, he also believes that it falls short in meeting a lot of the requirements for optimizing health, longevity, and even muscle gain. Andy also recently co-authored a book with Brian McKenzie, who you might recognize from 4 Hour Body, and Phil White, called Unplugged: Evolve from Technology to Upgrade Your Fitness, Performance and Consciousness. And I believe that is flying off the shelves right now. In this episode, we cover Andy's opinions on the pros and cons of the typical high-intensity training protocol, his personal training and diet regimen, and what he's changed his mind about regarding muscle adaptation and growth in the last year. For all of the show notes and links for this episode and all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org and wait till the end of this episode for your free gift. And now I give you Dr. Andy Galpin. Andy, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate you coming on to Corporate Warrior.
It's my pleasure, man.
Cool. So before we got recording officially, we were talking about high intensity training. Obviously, you're quite familiar with that. I just really like to get started by hearing your thoughts about that as a training protocol. I mean, most people that get involved in HIIT a lot of the time tend to be hard gainers, guys who struggle to put on muscle mass. And then they get into the science behind why muscle grows, and they kind of deviate towards high intensity training quite a lot of the time as a way to optimize muscular hypertrophy. So I'm really keen on what your thoughts are around that as a protocol versus other approaches that you're familiar with.
Yeah, well, I guess the first what I'd say is, it's probably the stupidest training protocol ever developed. I'm just kidding. Totally kidding. Wanted to catch Jeff Gard. No, I mean, clearly the people that innovated it, we were talking about Arthur earlier, and the people like Metzer that followed up after that. There's clearly results, and I'm sure that your tens of thousands of listeners would say, hey, I finally gained muscle, and I finally had improvements, etc. on it. So that level of, even though it's quote unquote anecdotal evidence, and it still is evidence that has merit nonetheless. So there are absolutely some benefits to that. There are limitations, of course. And if you look at the research specifically on muscle hypertrophy, it would probably suggest that frequency is more important. So being able to train a muscle more often, it looks like it's a bit more important than training it to complete exhaustion. So, for example, if you did a single set, or it doesn't even matter, multiple sets, but you just crushed your quads and they were fatigued to a point that you couldn't train them again for 7 more days. Well, it looks like if you would have just not gone quite so hard and gotten a second day in, even if the total volume was equated, training more frequently looks like it's more advantageous for muscle growth than a single set. Having said that, that doesn't mean there's no merit. It doesn't bust the myth of high intensity training or tell you that there's no value there. Those are the wrong interpretations entirely of those data. What it simply suggests is you should probably not do a single training style for ad nauseum. You probably shouldn't do high intensity training in this regard. And this is the only way you train for 20 years. You're going to have massive limitations, and eventually it's going to compromise your ability to grow. So having said that, I don't know too many people who do that, who just take one style of training and this is all they do for years on end. I mean, a lot of folks are, I'm going to do this for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever, and then I'm going to train. I'll change it a little bit. I'll either change the exercise or I'll change the prescription a little bit. And so as long as you're making slight alterations as you're going, that's going to put you in a good spot. So my criticisms, I guess, to sum it up, of this form of HIIT are not so different than they are of any style of training when it's taken to an extreme or it's taken to an absolute dogma. So it's not necessarily specific to this, but it would be general to anything.
Just a couple questions. So one of the first points you made about, well, actually, maybe not training to absolute failure and maybe increasing frequency might improve hypertrophy. Do you remember the specific studies that showed that?
There's been actually a large handful, and I believe Brad Schoenfeld just came out with a meta-analysis on the entire topic. So if you're not familiar with that, it's when you take basically all the studies ever done on a topic, look at them collectively. And so if there's enough studies being done to write a meta-analysis, that probably suggests, there's a lot of information on this topic. Brad would be an excellent guest for you. He would come on. I'm sure he would talk about it. You could read. Oh, there you go. So this is really a lot of his work that's done it. And I would generally suggest that frequency is it's not like, hey, it's a complete slam dunk. You're an idiot if you do it once a week. It just looks like it's a little bit more effective most of the time.
What do you think the mechanism is for that? So that versus, why would annihilating a muscle group or taking it to failure be potentially less effective than the former?
Yeah, we do have several mechanistic data on that. So a couple of things. Number one, there's no relationship between the amount of exhaustion or pain or sore you are and how much you grow. So if you put this on a scale, say, of 1 to 10, 10 being the sorest you could ever imagine, and 1 being nothing. Well, if you work out to a 7 today, and tomorrow you work out to a 9, you're not going to grow any more after the 9 than you are the 7. The resulting hypertrophy will be identical, and there's no relationship there between how sore or tired you feel and how much growth you get. So that's your first piece of information. Now, we actually do have some mechanisms behind that. If you understand a little bit about how a muscle cell grows, what basically happens is you've got a single cell. The cell wall activates what's called the signaling cascade. So these are little proteins that their job is to transmit signals or information from the cell wall to the nucleus. And the nucleus is the part of the tissue, or the muscle specifically, that holds its DNA, and it tells it to grow, shrink, die, repair, etc. So the first step is the signaling cascade activation. So that has to be strong and pronounced and significant enough for you to convince your DNA to go through the extensive resources required to grow more muscle. Because it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of protein, it takes a lot of resources in general to grow new muscle mass. So it's going to not do it unless it's thoroughly convinced. So the signaling response, number one, has to be strong enough or frequent enough. And I'll come back and I'll give you a very easy analogy with this as we get to the end. The same thing has to happen at the level of the nucleus. So it has to go through its replication of DNA. And then that actually has to go through a process. The third step would be protein synthesis, where you're actually combining amino acids and building a new protein. Well, we don't necessarily see great relationships between any of those 3 steps and downstream actual muscle growth. So what I mean is, if you increase protein synthesis by 25%, that doesn't necessarily mean your muscle is going to be 25% bigger. So something's being lost at some point along the way. And so there's major limitations what I'm about to say. So I'm shooting my own argument in the foot, in case you're wondering, because I'm just trying to be honest with you and saying, like, this is what we know and what we don't know. Having said all that, what we do see, it looks like, is that signaling response, that gene response, and that protein synthesis response look like they're really ramped up after exercise. The signaling proteins are usually maximized within seconds or hours after exercise. The gene expression is 4 to 8 hours. And then the protein synthesis is elevated for up to 24 to 48 hours. After that, though, those are all back down to baseline. And so if we come all the way back to the very beginning here, if you worked out once a week, you would have this massive impetus at the molecular level to grow for 24, 48, maybe 72 hours. But after that, you're going to be right back to where you started, probably. If you then worked out again every 3 days or 4 days, you sort of re-up that signal. And so the analogy you could give is, like if your kid and your child walked up to you and they wanted a candy bar or something, if they screamed the loudest scream in the history of mankind, it would probably result in you giving them a candy bar. But if they just screamed like a little bit loud, but they screamed all the time, like please, 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 come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Eventually you'd be like, fine. And so what we're really talking about with these is, like, either we make an extremely loud scream or we make it kind of loud for a bunch of times. Having said all of that, I'm not aware of very many data that have looked at specifically high intensity training at the molecular level compared to a split routine or even a total body routine 3 days a week when it's volume equated. Brad has done that work looking at what's the net result of the muscle, but no one's really done it from the mechanistic level. So there are a tremendous amount of these real practical training questions that we don't have answers to.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, Brad was on the show, and I'm familiar with the meta-analysis that you mentioned. Are you familiar with Dr. James Steele and Dr. James Fisher in the UK and some of their work? Have you heard of them?
No.
So they actually critiqued his meta-analysis. I can't remember the name of the study was like Beware of the Meta-Analysis, something rather. And I can't remember the bit in that study that the reason why, they felt that Brad's meta-analysis was flawed. So I'm not going to do that justice here. But I'm just curious whether you knew there was a critique.
Where did they publish that critique in?
I can't remember the journal, but I can send it to you afterwards, definitely, for you to review if you've got time. Yeah.
I mean, generally, if it made into a fairly decent high-impact journal, I probably saw it. But if they published it like on their blog, like, I probably didn't see it, Yeah,
it was on. It was definitely. I believe it was in a journal, but yeah, I don't know which one. So
yeah, no, I'm aware. Like, there are inherent. I mean, as you'll see as we get further into conversation, there are massive flaws to meta-analyses. I'm not a huge proponent of meta-analyses, Brad's or anybody else's. There's benefit to them, but there's also major downfalls to any of them. So I'm sure the folks you mentioned did a great and fair job of critiquing that, and I'm sure it was all.
Yeah, I guess it could be quite confusing for the layman because we just want truth, as you know. I mean, I know you get this all the time, and you're like, there is no truth.
There's no truth. That's the problem. So I think this is the bigger point. Of course, we're going to get here eventually, but this is the fundamental problem with the layman, where I blame them a little bit, saying like, that there's no answer here, so you're either searching for confirmation bias, or you're searching and flaws of somebody else's work when you know that you can find one. So what's the point? Like, whichever side you want to take this here, you're either searching for confirmation bias on one way or the other, so you wasted time. If you're trying to find a flaw, I can play this game all day. You could pick any study I've ever done, and I could point you on 1,000 flaws. So what's the point? Like, you're not doing yourself any service unless you feel like the paper was done maliciously, or the study was done with bias, intentional, purposeful bias. Then you have something, and that happens. That definitely happens. But if not, it's sort of like, well, what's the point? Like, you did this for your own ego. You did this to support what you already wanted to do anyway. So then what's the point of even wasting time reading the science? You might as well just let it go. So you have to be careful when you walk down those fields. My work, Brad's work, anything. I mean, I'm not like an advocate of everything he does or anybody else does. So I agree. It gets extremely confusing to the layperson. It gets confusing to the scientist too, man. Like, I'm like, okay, and I don't know what to do. So I think what we have to do is step back and say, well, what are we using science for? That's the bigger question. How are we interpreting? Why are we being so dogmatic about these things? That's the problem in the first place. It's not meant to be that way. Scientists are at fault for that. Trainers are at fault for that. Businessmen are at fault for that. And the consumer is also at fault for that. We all need to step back and go like, well, what does science mean? We can't prove things at all. We don't have nearly enough information to prove anything, especially with practical things like this. So we need to step back and simply say, well, here are the benefits potentially. This is what it looks like so far as a starting point. But what have you found in your 10,000 clients? Oh, something different. Okay, fantastic. Well, that's a little bit different. And let's work together of what we're finding instead of trying to fight each other and prove who's right or wrong and have these big pissing matches, which means nothing but confusion for everybody.
I completely agree. There is something I wanted to ask you on this. So there is a view within the high intensity training community that as you get stronger, you deliver more damage to yourself through your training, and therefore you require greater recovery. And some people take this to the extreme, and they might have 10 plus days between workouts. Personally, I don't do that, and I think most probably don't. But I was wondering, is there any evidence at all to show that you might need that much recovery from a workout? I suppose there might be if it's like really, really intense and there's tons. You don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there would be, I would guess, no information on that. Like, I don't know anyone I don't know even how you would feasibly do that study. You wouldn't be able to control for it. You wouldn't be able to reasonably ask a question. If you did something like that, I'm sure the answer would be no. That would only because it'd be a lack of control. Wouldn't necessarily be an omission of truth. It'd be difficult to figure out to make sure that the group is really the same type of person. So, for example, if you put somebody in who's not used to that type of training versus somebody who's been doing that for 8 years, well, you're going to get such different results that there's no way that any result is going to be statistically significant because they're going to be all over the board. So getting that level of control into a study would be very, very, very difficult. It would take a tremendous amount of work that I'm sure no one is willing to pay for. So therefore, like, I'm sure it's really not been done. And if it has been done, it's probably been done with like 8 subjects one time, which it may or may not say a lot of information. So I don't even need to dive hard in the literature to surmise that's probably the state of that literature. But having said that, like, okay, so when that's not available, then we have to then step back and say, well, who are these people using it? Like, are they actually ethical? Do we really believe them? Do they have something to sell behind it, or something else? Or are we trying this as an option? Do we try 3 or 4 other standard, quote unquote, scientifically proven methods that didn't work, and now we went to something else and we were seeing results? Well, that's pretty meritorious approach too.
You were talking about how, one being dogmatic about one modality for exercise might not be the ideal way to go for your kind of your career, your lifetime career of exercising. And why do you think that is? Is that because, I mean, obviously there's evidence to show that you become more trained in a specific skill, so you expend less energy if you repeat the same sort of thing. Is that the reason, or is there other reasons too why you think people should change up the modes?
Well, there's a multitude of reasons. I mean, that would be one of them. Obviously, the whole principle of overload. Right. So in order to induce adaptation that requires stress, overload being a frequent use, we frequently use overload as a way to stress the body in the terms of lifting weights, right? Well, eventually you're going to reach a point where you can no longer overload, right? If you're in the same exact routine, whether the weight gets high, the intensity gets too high, the volume gets too high, you're going to reach a point where you can no longer overload. So at that point, you need to introduce an alternate stress. So in the modifiable variables realm, this could be a different exercise selection. It could be a different rest interval. Could be something different. So, I mean, just at the simplest term right there suggests, well, we probably should have very frequent alterations in our training style. Secondly, you could look, I mean, you'd be hard pressed, I think, to find a lifelong athlete or somebody who's been training hard for more than a few decades who doesn't do this very frequently as well. I mean, you can pick anything you want. I was just with some guys that worked at the Bulgarian national weightlifting team. And it's like, yeah, you saw the Bulgarian method, and they stuck with that for a long time. And we go from a continuum here. On one side of the continuum is specificity. The other side of the continuum is adaptation or development. So specificity gets you very, very, very good at that specific task, but it often compromises adaptation and development. So yeah, you could do a 1 rep max every single day and you would get tremendously strong, but that's only going to last for 6 months, a year, 6 years, some point where you're going to be able to say, like, we're no longer developing or building infrastructure. We're only optimizing what we have. And that inherently is going to limit our potential adaptation. The other bigger approach would be, why are you doing this in the first place? Like, if we're talking about your physical exercise practice, why would you ever think that you're going to optimize health by doing a single thing your entire life? That's going to make you very, very physiologically limited. So you might have this baseline amount of hypertrophy, but you're going to have massive lacking in everything else. And if life or longevity and the quality of life are concerns for you, you're going to have what we call holes in your physiology. You're going to have major holes and major limitations.
So, okay, that's interesting. So, for example, a lot of my listeners, they'll do maybe like a Body by Science Big Five, which is something that was made popular by obviously Dr. Doug McGuff. Are you familiar with his book and that his work? Yeah. So that would be like a chest press, leg press, pull down, etc. They might do that once or twice a week, and they'll probably do plenty of movement, lots of walking. So you feel like, okay, and then what? Just to add to that, so they might practice that for 3 months, let's say, and then maybe they vary their exercise protocol, but it's still a single set to failure type training protocol, right? So like, do you still feel like if you progress for your training career within that kind of framework, that there still be holes in they still have
huge holes?
Well, can you elaborate? Because I'm interested.
What
sort of problems, and how would you address those?
So the first thing is we have to have a sort of a bigger conversation first.
Okay.
We have to step back out of, well, why am I exercising in the first place? What's my goal? What am I doing this for? Like, if your only goal is to maximize muscle growth, this is a separate conversation than if we're trying to develop an athlete, if we're trying to make sure that you are as healthy and live as well as possible. Like, these are all separate conversations.
Okay. To make it okay, I appreciate that's a really tough answer if I don't specify. So, or tough question. So, assume I mean just if we're just talking about longevity and health? Because obviously, as you know, muscle is so correlated with, longevity and good health later on in life. But also, quality of life, being able to move around. But I'm not talking about optimizing for a specific sport. That's a separate question. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So then that makes it even easier to have the conversation. So in that particular case, the training example you gave me, that would give you extreme holes in your physiology if wellness, longevity, just being healthy and having energy is the goal. Your approach would lead to a lot of problems. So we could spend a lot of time going over this stuff. But for examples, in the things you listed, there was no speed development there. There's virtually no power development. If you look at the research on speed and power, those are also significant predictors of mortality. So for example, if you are 70 or 80 or 60, it doesn't matter the age, but you trip and fall, your ability to put your foot out in front of you is requiring two things: foot speed, to be able to get the foot in the place it needs to be there, but then the eccentric strength to catch it. So in this case, your training example, you may have requisite eccentric strength because you're lifting enough heavy stuff. It's not truly strength training because the volume's high, the speed's low, right? And the nuanced sense of it, but it would be enough. You would be strong enough if you trained that hard with enough weights. You'd be strong enough to catch yourself from a fall, most likely, but you may or may not have the foot speed to get out there in time. You wouldn't have any other planes of movement. You wouldn't have any, maybe what we'll call segment connectivity. So your ability to move your left quadricep is not segmented to your back right shoulder, and that's not related at all to your left hand. And so the ability to do multiplanar or dynamic, unpredictable, unstable movements is going to be compromised at some level. And yes, I'm fully aware and I'm a strength guy first. Like, I'm not a functional movement guru. Like, it's not what I do. Like, I don't practice yoga on rocks or like anything like that. And I'm very much aware the stronger you are at the single muscle level, the easier it is to manipulate your own body. But at some point, if you don't learn the mechanics of movement, that's compromised. That's a neuromuscular issue. There's a neural control issue there. And that's not negotiable. This is how these things work. If you don't practice the skill of movement, you lose that. You don't have that skill of movement. So we've eliminated movement entirely. If you think walking once a week for an hour improves your VO2 max, you're out of your mind. Right. So your cardiovascular fitness is significantly compromised. Now, I know that the heart rate gets very high during high intensity training. It's going to be probably to the max, but your ability to sustain, say, 70% without a break for, 30 minutes, that's going to be compromised. You probably can't swim. You can't jog. Like, all these things that are basic human qualities. I mean, I know these things because I went through these periods too. And I realized, like, I can't jog for 30 minutes without my knee getting sore. Or having to jog so damn slow that I can barely move. That's a problem if you look at what the human body is developed and meant to be able to do, right? We're supposed to be able to probably jog for hours at a time, but we've gone so far down just the pure strength training hypertrophy end of the spectrum, we've really lost a tremendous amount of movement. And then there's a whole host of things. You're probably very poor at doing intervals, recovering and coming back. If you're doing a single set to failure, you're not used to what we'll call repeated sprintability, repeated maximal anaerobic ability, because you do a single time and then you're done. Your anaerobic threshold is probably very, very high because you're used to dealing with tremendous suffering for 30 seconds or a minute at a time, which is really awesome and good for you. But those other pieces are just going to be eliminated. I would question your agility, your balance, and we could just go on and on and on. And just to be super clear, if you're like on fire right now, I'm not saying that training is bad for you. I'm cannot be supporting that stuff even more. I'm simply saying, if you truly want to be as well-rounded, so you're as healthy and all those things as possible, there are other things that are required of human physiology and human longevity that are needed also to be incorporated into you besides lifting really heavy to exhaustion and walking. Like, that's a pretty limited end of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You're right to address the audience there. It's funny because I know that a lot of the books in this space and the literature that they all point to suggests that, if you're doing a high intensity strength training type regimen, you're going to meet most of those requirements. I know you've just explained why that isn't the case in your opinion. And because it was my understanding that, if you do participate in this type of regimen, that you are going to have speed and power and foot speed as
you're not going to get fast,
an outcome, but you don't think that's the case.
You're not going to get fast if you're not moving fast. Like that's not going to happen. Now, let's qualify here. If you take somebody who's 50 years old and they haven't worked out in 12 years and they did nothing but a high intensity, let's make it the most extreme example. They did high intensity on machines, so machine shoulder press, machine leg press, all that. I promise you, after 6 or 8 weeks, they're probably more powerful. They're probably faster. They're like, everything gets better. But that's not because of the training per se, or the magic of high intensity training. That's because they're so untrained to begin with. So what I'm really saying is, yeah, you might see some results when you take somebody who's untrained. But you know what's funny about that? We have a significant data on cycling that suggests if you take somebody and put them through 12 weeks of cycling, so low intensity, steady state, 30 minutes of straight cycling, that they will achieve as much, if not more, leg hypertrophy than if you did 12 weeks of strength training in an untrained old woman. Like, and those are dozens, hundreds of studies in that area. So that's not saying like, oh, cycling for 30 minutes, that's the new way to bulk up. Like, no, what it's saying is when you're super untrained, oh, and by the way, those people also get more powerful, speed goes up, etc. So what that says is, like, if you go from a baseline minimum of very little muscular activation, very little muscular use, and you start doing virtually anything, you're going to see improvements across the board. Yeah. But that's far, far, far different than putting you on a routine. If we said those old ladies, or these people in your particular case, said, we're going to do one hypertrophy workout, 10 minutes twice a week, we'll do some speed stuff, etc., and you mix this all in, that would give them far more development in those areas, and it would get them a far longer increase over time in those specific areas. So I guarantee you, and I can say this without any hesitation, if you've done nothing but high intensity machine leg press, etc., for the last 5 years, you are not any faster than you were 5 years ago, and you might be slower. So that's where it really gets out. So we have to be careful of how we're understanding this, and make sure we're being as clear as possible, saying, like, what do you mean, will it work or not work? Well, it always depends on the situation here. So hopefully, I hope that cleared up some of the things.
No, it did, and I appreciate you expressing your opinion. It's really interesting because it's too often I probably get high intensity training advocates. So it's nice to get kind of different opinions for people to then listen.
Let's also let me clarify some more further terms too. Especially for any of my listeners that come over or something like this. Your world probably understands this difference between high intensity training or HIIT training and high intensity training or HIIT training. Right? So like the vast majority of the world's like, you just said the same thing twice. Right? So a lot of people will refer to high intensity training as interval training. So 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off on it, cycles, things like that. And that is a form of, whether you want to call that high intensity training, whether you want to call that interval training, some people call that sprint interval training or HIIT training, high intensity interval training. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what I've been talking about. You're talking about the classic, Arthur Jones high intensity training that was at Penn State for decades is usually a single set to extreme failure of one exercise, maybe 2 or 3 exercises a day, but that's what we're talking about. So we have to be careful when we're interpreting scientific literature and we just Google HIIT or high intensity training and saying, oh, this paper showed another benefit of HIIT. Like, well, which kind of HIIT are we talking about here?
Yeah. And I know that a lot of the guys, the more sort of science-based guys who proponents of high intensity strength training don't like to use it. They like to call evidence-based, I think, resistance training or resistance exercise. They prefer to use that as a so as not to confuse people. I
don't care.
No, but
as long as we're all clear.
It's just otherwise it's just cliche, isn't it? Okay. So yeah,
I mean, if you look at general strength too, like again, for all the benefits. So this is probably all going to get lost on the fire of rage, but like I can't express enough. I have done a ton of HIIT training. I will do HIIT training again. I use it very, very frequently. I think it's a fantastic modality. But like any modality, you could pick anything I've ever wrote that I was a proponent of, and I would stand there right there and say, well, it's limited in this, it's limited in that, it's limited in that. And like, this is just the nature of things. Like, nothing is a perfect solution. If you think that, you can stop listening now because you're not doing yourself any favors. I'm not doing you any favors either. This is a pointless conversation. Go on and just do the same thing the rest of your life and come back when it didn't work. Right. So everything has a limitation, right? This conversation, podcasting has a limitation versus input. Like, everything has pros and cons here. So that, I think we have to do that. When we do that, then we can have awesome conversations about saying, well, how are you implementing it? What are you saying? Oh, okay. I didn't think that was going to work, but okay, maybe you have evidence to suggest it is working. Okay, great. So if you look at strength as another thing, traditionally over time, especially in well-trained people, a single set at a slow velocity is not going to be the best option possible for maximizing strength. Doesn't mean it won't work. It just won't be as good as something that is a single repetition to strength. Like this is specificity at its finest, right? Like this, and we have extensive thousands of studies, athletes, weightlifters, powerlifters that would show this to be sort of meritorious. But having said that, those folks are not great at growing muscle. So like strength training is not the answer either. Intervals on the bike isn't the answer. Like we have all these modalities, and the fact that we're fighting over one answer is just, I think, a general waste of time. Let's just talk about how we can get better and what things we can implement. And saying, oh, I thought this was going to work. Oh, it didn't work for you. Oh, okay. Well, the science says it should, but it didn't. Okay, fine, no problem. Let's continue exploring things that work for you. In addition, and I'll sort of stop here, one of the things that scientists I think are overly critical of that they don't understand because they're too busy being scientists, is how easy it is to implement and how realistic it is. If I can send you to the gym and say, here are your 2 exercises, you're going to get thoroughly warmed up, go good and slow, like the injury risk of acute injury is probably fairly low. You're going to get results, you're going to feel good, and it's going to take you 20 minutes and you're out of there. Versus you give me this hour-and-a-half program that has all the stuff in it, I'm not probably going to have the time to do it. I'm not going to do it. So you tell me who won, the guy that did the 20-minute slightly less effective workout or the dude who didn't show up, period. So that is like other whole conversations when we're dealing with real people and we're dealing with real life that says like we got to acknowledge here that just because what science says, that's just a starting place. But there's exceptions all over the board.
Yeah, no, well said. I got a few questions here from listeners that I wanted to ask you. There's this concept called the central nervous system, not concept, but I guess thing. And people talk about central nervous system or CNS overtraining. And I'm listener broached this question. I thought it was a good question because it's not something I understand very well. Is it actually possible to overtrain your central nervous system? And if that's true, and there's evidence to support it, what is the mechanism? Have you looked? I don't know if that's outside your expertise or whether that's something that you've looked into.
Well, I'm not a central nervous system guy per se or girl. If somebody hopped on your show and said what I'm about to say is wrong, I would acquiesce to them if that's what their field is. It's a bit difficult. I'm generally with you. I react poorly to those things. I'm like, come on. We can't give all the credit and all the blame to the central nervous system. Just because you did one heavy rep, your central nervous system's not fried. I promise you it doesn't care. Having said that, we have to remember that the nervous system requires energy just like muscle does. And it's ATP, which is the energy currency of all biology. It has to go through metabolism. It has to break down sugar for energy, things like this. Like it has the same sodium, potassium pumps, all this stuff. When you exhaust those things, just like in muscle, you're going to compromise function. So to directly answer your question, is there mechanisms for nervous system fatigue? Yeah, it's not that complicated. It's actually the exact same one as muscle. Now, if I believe this is correct, but I don't know of many nerves that have the ability to go through much aerobic metabolism, especially if you get to like the astrocytes in the brain. Those are pretty much going to be reliant upon glucose and lactate and a few other things potentially. So that would be your mechanism. I think the more confusing thing that I just don't know of, and again, I'm with you here, is like, well, what place is this really playing in? I'm waking up and I'm tired today, or I'm overtrained today. Am I really central nervous system trained, or am I underslept, or like have I just not had my coffee yet? Like what is that really central nervous system fatigue? I don't know. I don't think I buy that as much as most people say it. I know I don't. But again, you're talking about a field that has very, very little scientific exploration.
You obviously work with or have worked with a lot of athletes in the past. I think there's a view among a lot of people, and I certainly have this view that a lot of athletes succeed in spite of their training, in spite of their coaches, right? So, totally. You talked about this on Joe Rogan. How these coaches get the accolades for this amazing training system they've created when really that probably wasn't optimal or even beneficial, but the athlete succeeded in spite of it. And often these guys are, they're genetic freaks, right? There's a selection bias. They've got where they are because of that stuff. But I am curious, when you've had to optimize hypertrophy, like maybe for one of your athletes who has to gain weight, what have you found to be most effective from a, I guess, diet and training protocol? I don't know. I guess it's not a one size fits all. Maybe that's not an easy one to answer, but
it's super easy because you just answered it. Like there's not one protocol that I would ever put an athlete on that says like, oh, you got to gain muscle. This is what we're going to go do. Mm-hmm. I actually am fairly comfortable saying an athlete like that in general would be your classic high responder anyways. So they're the person who probably the details matter least, right? Like they're not the person we have to tease out the optimal program, and I'm not going to waste their time. I'm not going to waste their emotional time splitting hairs over like, oh my God, do we do this or do we do this? I work in a combination of things depending on the athlete. If they're here local, if they're one of my online or virtual clients and they're in New York or Texas or Vegas or in Australia, well, those are going to be different programs because I can't necessarily be there to see the whole program. They may have a strength coach already who's really, really good. And then we can just have some conversations about ideas. They may have a crappy one or none at all, and they may be on their own. So I'm not going to put all those athletes on the same extremely complex, periodized over time training program. I'm setting them up for failure. So I would absolutely never do that. Having said all that, it's not extremely difficult. Like it's not past the basics. It's generally going to be something like, let's land in the 6 to 20 repetition range. Do something till you're pretty dang tired. Get tired, don't smoke yourself, smash yourself, and let's see if we can get in 2 to 3 training sessions a week. Like that's, I know we're painting broad strokes, but principally would that be like a full body routine typically? Sometimes. What's difficult about it is, now keep in context here. I don't work with fitness or figure or bodybuilding athletes ever. I work with sporting athletes. And I work mostly with combat sport athletes. So here's an example. I have an athlete who needs to put on 10 pounds or 5 kilos of muscle, right? Doesn't matter. Well, they also have to go to kickboxing practice. And they also have to go to jiu-jitsu practice. And they have to get kicked in the leg. If they walk out of the gym the next day, they're so sore, they're hopping around and someone kicks them in the leg and they're in tears. Like, I failed. Like, this is not going to work. They're going to fire me, etc. So keep that in context when I'm saying these things. I'm not working for somebody who has the luxury of laying in bed for 3 more days, optimizing, getting massages and recovering. Like they have got to go to sporting practice too. So I have to be able to achieve this hypertrophy within the context of understanding it is a secondary principle, if not a tertiary principle to what they're doing. So this is not the answer I would say for all of you. If you're like, if this is not your scenario, then what I'm saying is it may be not super important for you. But that's why I would say I'm not going to put them on anything that gets them super, super, super sore. I want them to be a little like, oh man, like I'm kind of tight today. Like, oh, I'm a little sore here. But I know they're going to go to boxing practice. And if their right shoulder is sore in boxing practice and they throw a bad punch because of it and then they tear something, like this is my fault. So that's just the lens I'm answering your question through, is when you ask me what I do with my athletes, those are my athletes. So that's how I do it.
Have you ever had the instance where you've got, let's say you're working with an athlete who's quite ectomorphic and they have the same requirement to add muscle mass, and you've tried everything, but you just can't seem to add lean mass? Have you had that type of situation happen, or have you always been able to do it somehow?
Yeah, I've never really had that issue, with the exception of one female. And she had that issue because she just didn't want to do the training and didn't want to eat because she really didn't want to gain the weight. So she was concerned with her social media and the appearances and stuff like that. So she's like, yeah, I need to gain it. But then secretly, when it boiled down to it, we're like, what's going on? She's like, I actually don't want to put on any muscle. I think I look too bulky. We're like, fantastic. So having said that, no, like I generally don't think it's that complicated. I acknowledge there are people like that for sure. I know a ton of them, but those people generally just need more volume or more food or something different. So those are people who are clearly like, hey, look, the science is not going to work for you. So we got to think outside the box here. We got to try different stuff. But most of the folks I've worked with, it's generally not that difficult for them to get there. Because again, I'm generally working with pretty high level athletes, and they just tend to be responders.
Yeah, that's it's nice to hear you say that, because I just think a lot of coaches don't admit that.
Yeah, like, yeah, it's not that complicated with them. A lot. They're also the same responders to strength and everything else too. It's like you do 2 workouts and they're like kind of great, and then all of a sudden they come back and they're faster already. You're like, fabulous. Like, so.
As we've been talking, I really enjoyed your episode with Joe Rogan. I really liked how when you don't know something, you just defer, and I don't think enough people do that, you know. So I respect that, and you were refreshingly honest. You guys touched on cool showers and cold exposure and that type of thing. I personally do that just for like mood elevation. I don't know the mechanism or how it works, but I just feel great when I come out. And I'm really,
man, sometimes that's enough.
Yeah.
Like sometimes that's enough.
Right.
Why does there have to be 35 papers on it before we can do something that says like, it just made me feel better in the morning? Like,
but it doesn't mean that I can't be interested in knowing why that is. That's why you're a scientist, right? You like to know the reasons why. Not obsessively, but I'm interested. Do you know why like cold exposure has like that kind of mood? I know again it's probably outside of your domain, but just came up for me. Like why it has that kind of effect on the body?
So yes and no. What I'll do is I'll plant a flag here and says like I'll tell you what we know now, but we know very little. So I'll do the best I can with what we know, and I will admit though that it's extremely limited. So if you come back and find a study that comes out or look at like, yeah, I admit to you, we just don't know a lot about this stuff. In addition, when you ask a question about something like mood, you automatically acknowledge that's something extremely subjective. So how we could ever tease out placebo effect from actual effect is virtually impossible when you ask for subjective measures. So right there, it's inherently flawed of a question that we could almost never answer scientifically. So if you hate ice or love ice, either way, like you can blow this argument apart because it's subjective. Having said that, a little bit of early data suggests you've got some hormonal things kicking in that can happen. So you've got a combination of dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are all surging depending on how you do the cold exposure, when too much. Am I going to try to convince you that taking a cold shower elevates endorphins by 200%? No, like that's probably not going to do it. It's also maybe extremely transient. So if it's elevated, it might be up for 5 minutes, then back down. I don't know. Those are all very, very possible. But it's almost impossible for us to tease out psychology from physiology and things like this. So tough. I mean, again, the potential mechanisms are looking like they're mostly hormonal, dopamine being the number one thing, and epinephrine, norepinephrine. After that, it's sort of like, oh, you tell me, bro. Like, did you feel better? Okay, well, let's take some blood and eventually look at it. Like, but depending on your cold exposure, it takes us, you either have to be kind of cold for a really long time to make those measures start to actually be pronounced to where we can tell it's more than just a random fluctuation or a response to the acute change in temperature, or it has to be tremendously cold for a short bout. And so that's about the best we know in terms of things like mood. That's all the information we have.
Cool. I always ask guests about their personal training and dietary habits and stuff like that. I've not heard you talk about that before, although I've not listened to a lot of interviews you've done, to be honest. What does your training approach look like currently? What is your kind of exercise routine, that type of thing, diet? Give us like a snapshot.
So we'll do diet. That's sort of the easier one. So I practice a lot of variety. So I generally eat what we call very clean. So I eat mostly fresh vegetables, animals, things like that. I'm very fortunate where I live and my background, I'm able to hunt game. So my freezer is mostly full of wild antelope that I've killed, elk, things like that. So I get a lot of our protein and our animal fats from there. I also live in Southern California, which means I'm 15 minutes from the ocean. So we eat a lot of fresh fish and seafood that's freshly been caught. I'm very, very, very fortunate for both of those things. I don't have a tremendous amount of money, but we have enough to where we can make it a priority and give up other things in our life. So I'm very fortunate in all those things. And then the rest, we have a lot of local farms and things like that where we can get our vegetables, things like that. So I'm not ketogenic. I'm not paleo. I don't do any of those things. But when you eat mostly animals and vegetables, that doesn't leave a lot of room for many other things. So I'm not anti-grain, but grain's not a huge part of my diet because we'd rather get vegetables. And if I got more room, I'd rather eat more oysters or salmon or mackerel or whatever. But we will eat rice. I'll eat potatoes, sweet potatoes, white potatoes. I'm not against any of those things. But we'll all opt for a vegetable and meat most of the time. And then I feel best generally with about 5 or so meals a day. That's when I feel best. Yep.
That's quite. Is that like 5 very small meals? Is that?
Yeah. Like I'm just honestly like I'm a pretty. If you, my wife eats more than I do, more total food and more per. Even though she's 50 pounds less than I am, but she's way more active throughout the day. She's way. I mean, I'm on the phone. I'm doing like on the computer for most of the day, and I'm on my standing desk and stuff. But I'm burning like a few calories, or I'm walking around as I'm on phone calls. But she's running around chasing kids all day, so she's burning tons of calories. But I generally eat like half the meal she makes, and then like I'll wait for a few more hours, eat the other half, and she just like scarfs it all down. And so she does really good on like 3 big meals a day, and I do better on like 4 to 6 or so, just kind of like the same size meals, if you will. Having said that, we also practice a lot of variety in our diet. So sometimes we'll go on small protein fasts. We'll go on pure fasts. I'll move to 1 meal a day for times. I'll move to, straight fasting. And I try to introduce a lot of variety so that I have enough metabolic flexibility to I can sustain really a lot of things. Because I've practiced all these different things, we've done keto, we've done a bunch of different stuff. I've actually been able to figure out, like, of all those things, here's where I fit best, which is my sort of smaller things. But had I just like stick to one routine because the science said it or because somebody else said it, I would have never actually known and understood what I felt best on and what she felt best on. Having said that, also now that I know what I feel best on, that doesn't mean I stick to it all the time, because that's going to create problems eventually. So we have probably 80% of the time, that's what I eat, like 85%. I don't know, some random number. I don't count or track. But then occasionally we'll do other stuff just for the sake of making sure we introduce variety. We also tend to eat mostly seasonal. So what's in season, we'll eat more of. And if it's not, that doesn't mean I won't eat an apple when it's not apple season. But we'll just try to get the local fresh stuff as much as we possibly can. So that's diet. Yeah. Any questions there? You want to move on to training?
Go on to training, yeah.
Okay. So it's the same basic approach with training. I spend probably, the most significant percentage of my training is based around strength and lifting and things like that. That's still my background. So it's big, complex movements first: squats, deadlifts, pressing, pulling. That's the vast majority of what I do. And then from there, it's either isolation work, so single joint work if I need it, or if there's a specific area I'm needing to develop, either strength-wise or size-wise, or for whatever reason, if it's acting up, if I need to correct or imbalance, something like that. But then after that large bubble, we make sure at least once a week we do something of more of a steady state straight endurance. And this could be anything from jogging with the dogs to paddle boarding to rowing to we may do like a small circuit of 5 to 10 or 15 different exercises and continually keep moving. This could include farmers carries or walks or sled pushes, like things like that. We have a few machines. We'll hit a few machines too. I do almost at least once a week something of extremely high intervals. So this could be everything from 30 on, 30 off to 30 on, 5 minutes off, or 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, sort of repeated. And the exercise selection itself, again, varies. Could be a bike, rower, combination of weights. I also still kickbox, go to grappling practice and jiu-jitsu practice as much as I can, moving in those planes. So I try to have, sometimes we go to the ocean and do stuff in the water. So hiking, sometimes the mountains. So it really just depends. I try to have a lot of variety as a general principle. But then what we typically do is have, say, 4 to 6 week blocks where I focus on something specifically. So actually today I'm starting a new 6-week block on speed and power. So we'll do all that stuff, but I'll focus more of the attention on speed and power. I'll introduce more of those exercises. I'll do less hypertrophy. I'll do less conditioning so that I'm recovered enough, and I'll train really frequently. And after that, we'll probably do a 6-week strength block where it's basically the same thing. We focus more on absolute strength, And then from there, I'm not really sure. So that's the next 12 weeks.
Cool. I've got a few kind of rapid fire questions. Obviously, the answers don't have to be rapid fire.
Sure.
With regard to your specialty area, so muscle fiber types, muscle adaptation and growth, that type of stuff, what have you changed your mind about there in the last year or in recent memory?
Probably one of them that I've changed a lot on. Well, there's two that kind of stick out. One is fiber size. So I'm now fairly convinced, I should say, willing to admit that all fiber types are probably naturally about the same size. And what's larger, when a fiber type is larger, so if a fast twitch fiber is larger in diameter or a slow twitch is larger in diameter, it's probably response to training that fiber type a lot. Where I previously would be like, no, fast twitch fibers are always going to be bigger. This is just for a bunch of molecular reasons, they should be always bigger. And I just have enough data from my colleague, Jimmy Bagley at San Francisco. And he's like, man, I got 30,000 fibers in this database, and like just not necessarily bigger when they're equated for training. I'm like, damn. So that's a recent one. And that actually follows up to my second one, which is to say now I used to not think that specific types of training increased or changed muscle fiber type hypertrophy specifically. So maybe something like people make the claim, hey, maybe some like 5 to 10 reps per set will increase the fast twitch fibers more, but 20 or 35 or 20 or 25 or 30 reps per set targets the slow twitch fibers. And I used to not believe that. And now there's enough evidence sort of combined with what I just said is saying maybe we probably do have some fiber type specific hypertrophy going on. And then we actually have some very new data from my lab in the last couple of weeks. This suggests, I'm sure you're familiar with the post-exercise anabolic window.
Yes, about protein consumption. Was that?
Yeah. So, well, it's protein as well as carbohydrate or all fuel consumption. It's if you're not familiar, it's the basic idea that you have to eat immediately post-exercise, or you magically lose all your gains or something. But what we actually have now is we have some pretty convincing fiber type specific data that suggests that post-exercise anabolic window, the length, how long it is actually fiber type specific. So there's a different range for the fast twitch fibers versus the slow twitch fibers. So if you have more fast twitch fibers, that window might be more or less important than if you have more slow twitch fibers. And that's something I would have said no way on until we saw it in our lab in the last couple of months. And we're probably getting short on time, but yeah, we could have a whole conversation on the merits for and against post-exercise anabolic window, which is something actually Brad and I think he's a bit short-sighted on his approach on that. We'll put it that way.
We'll leave it
so,
that.
Yeah, no, like I totally agree with most he's saying, but he's just not seeing the full context. I see some situations where there's merit there. Anyways.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's confused. Let me just answer that in 2 minutes. So if you're familiar, the post-exercise okay, so some people argue, like, is it true or not true? And if you look at all the data, it suggests it's not true. Sort of. But we have to take people and their lives into consideration here. So, for example, if what time is it now locally for you? Like 5 p.m.?
5:30, yeah.
5:30. Okay, fine. Have you eaten yet today?
Yes.
How many times?
Once.
Once. Okay.
Yeah.
So, what percentage of the total food that you're going to eat today have you eaten already today? Like 50%?
Yeah, about that. About 50%.
Okay, close enough.
So I
40, 60%.
Yeah.
Cool. Whatever. All good, right? So if you went to go work out right now and you got a workout session in, it probably wouldn't matter if you ate right after that workout or not. Because you have a bunch of food in your system, it's not going to matter. So in your particular case, the total amount of food and the total amount of protein that you consume throughout the total day is more important than if you got it 30 minutes post-exercise or 20 minutes post-exercise. It's not going to matter in your case. But some people work out in the morning or at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. without having eaten before that. So now they're coming off of like a 16, 18-hour fast. Those people, it's actually fairly important that they get food in pretty close to now there's no magical 30 minutes, but the sooner the better, right? Earlier when we talked about that signaling, gene expression, and protein synthesis thing, I told you it's very transient. You have seconds to hours. Well, if you don't have sufficient fuel or supply around when that signal is the most prime, you're maybe not going to optimize growth. So if you look at the general literature, it would suggest, hey, actually, it doesn't matter. It's a myth. Well, it's not a myth. It's just a myth because most people don't train fasted and then not eat after that. So it just depends on context, which I think is the bigger thing. So that's one thing where like the meta-analyses, and it's a great example. This is a great critique of the meta-analyses approaches that could never show that. And the meta-analysis would only say like, well, it's not there, it's not true. Well, it is there, and it is true. It just may not matter for the vast majority of people. And that's all science does, right? It's like, well, this is not super important for everybody, but for a lot of us, and now we have that detailed suggesting fiber type. Well, it depends on the type of training you did, depends on the goal, depends on your own physiology a little bit. It may or may not be more or less important for for some of us out there. So I think I kept that to like 3 minutes.
No, that's fine. That's good. Thanks for explaining it.
Yeah.
What are you currently working on at the moment? I know you've just recently released a book, Unplugged.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what you're working on currently. What would you like to sort of plug at the end here?
Okay, so I just sort of talked about a little bit what our lab is working on. So my postdoc Irene Tobias is doing a lot of work looking at a bunch of these post-exercise anabolic window and some other proteins called AMPK. And we're specifically looking at it in response to high-intensity training. Now, this would be the high-intensity interval version of high-intensity training, not your version of HIIT training. So we're trying to tease out a lot of the signaling mechanisms and some of the fiber type specific stuff going on there. We're looking at a lot of stuff called the nuclei and the fiber type specific nuclei and how they operate, trying to understand how some muscle fibers grow. I mean, the classic example is, those hard gainers, we're trying to figure out like what's different about their fibers from the nuclei perspective about why they're growing and they're not growing. And are they non-responders, or do they truly just need more volume, or is that nonsense? And then what's the physiological mechanism? Sort of explaining that. So that's some of the lab work we have going on.
Cool.
The book, of course, is out called Unplugged: Evolve from Technology to Upgrade Your Fitness, Performance, and Consciousness. And that is like almost nothing related to anything we talked about today, but it's really a guide for how to use and how to not misuse technology for your training. So this is everything from heart rate monitors to Dartfish to Coach's Eye to Fitbit to HRV to any of these trackers. It's not an anti-technology book. It is a pro-technology book, and it is here's how to use it, but here's how it can screw you in your training up. So make sure that this doesn't happen to you. So that's up on Amazon right now, and that's been up for a month now or something, month and a half.
Awesome.
That's going very well, and we just started filming last night, season 2 for our podcast. So that should be coming out in October, November-ish, something like that.
And that's Body of Knowledge, isn't it? Your podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll link to that from the show notes. Cool.
Cool.
Any final thoughts you want to leave the listeners with at all?
No, what I say is, I truly believe, probably like you do, the reason why you're doing this podcast, I'm just surmising, but like this is the stuff that actually makes the field move forward, that we can have discussions that are collegial, and that we actually, most important thing is that we listen to learn. We don't listen to reply. And that's the biggest downfall I think we necessarily have, is we're listening so we can find holes so we can reply and attack, instead of listening to really understand. And this is not something I'm perfect at either. All the time I fail myself on this, and I have to. It's just that I'm trying. I'm trying. It's the way I've heard this explained, I think by Dan Sullivan, is there's a difference between being a knower versus a learner. And I won't go into this. You can go look this up on your own, folks. But a knower is somebody who knows the answer and knows the information, knows the data. A learner is somebody who's continually saying, boy, like I've never heard it that way. I didn't think that was the case. Like you've been doing the whole last hour. I didn't think that was true. Like, explain to me why that is. Right? That's the right mindset, is constantly being, it's okay to have your opinion and your belief system, but you don't ask that learner like, I didn't think that was true. What are you talking about? Where's your evidence? Like, that's not a learner. That's a knower who's acting like they're a learner. But genuinely, I can see the look on your face. I can see the attitude where, like, some of the things I said, you're like, I can see your brain going like, I don't think that's true. but you're at least you're fighting that instinct
Damn
and
it,
going
am I
like,
that obvious?
well, we all are, right? Like this is good.
You're right, and like I feel like during this interview, I'm in and out of that. So sometimes I'm like in that learner phase, and then I drop into that other mode, and I'm like, damn it,
But yeah, we all are though. Like this is not something you are at one point. This is a constant battle, and just the more often you can fight that battle, or at least to be self-aware and start saying like, well, when's the last time I listened to a contrary position, not so that I could find the holes in it, but really trying to understand that perspective. It's been a long time, and you can really self-address that, and then maybe we start to listen. And there's some easy drills that you can do, and we can finish on this. But every time not every time, but I try to as often as I can remember. That might be 10% of the time. When something comes up that is against my beliefs or my thoughts, before I will respond, I try to envision 2 to 3 scenarios in which I didn't see the perspective well enough to understand why they could be saying that. And if you do that, it's just a simple practice. You can still have your opinion and you can progress through, but what you'll find is over time is you like actually, you'll catch yourself being like, oh, that can't be true that way. And you want to respond to this person like they're an idiot. And then you look back and you go, oh, well, I looked on their Twitter page and it looks like they deal mostly with older adults. So maybe from that perspective, maybe that's not the worst message ever. Now I'm going to respond totally different on Twitter to that message. Or now I won't. It doesn't matter if it's Twitter or anybody else, social interaction, your job. And so it's just a practice of, it's the old saying of like, walk a mile in their shoes first. But it's just trying to see the perspective of, well, what do they mean when they say that? I do this every semester in my classes. I show a bunch of Mike Metzer videos. And he's crazy, right? He's hilarious. If you guys haven't seen him, his stuff on there with his training. And all of my students are ready to just hammer him, right? Because it's just like against everything in the textbook. But we have to step back, and I use that as a way to go through this whole concept of saying, like, what do you know was wrong here? And they go through and they list all the things they know are wrong. And then we hit him with, well, really, what do you, like, why? Well, you're an athletic trainer that works with Division I soccer players. Who is he working with? Where's his perspective? Why is he saying this is how you do things? Oh, yeah, well, let's look at his perspective and what he was saying. And the people he was probably making the video for is not a 22-year-old athletic trainer. Oh, okay. So now where is the truth now? Oh, okay. And that, I think, is just a good example. And it's funny that I didn't know you were in a hit advocate like this, but like he's a great example of somebody I literally use every semester to say, like, there's truth here. We can learn from people like this if we're willing to accept and look at the broader perspective of truth.
Is that the video where he's I think he's on stage addressing it's not that one, is it? Oh, okay.
I use several of them, but the ones I use, I can't remember the bodybuilder he has in there.
Is it Casey Viator? Or
I can't remember, but it's a cut from his video, from his DVD, and he's walking like a reporter through, and the guy's he does some deadlifts, he does some leg presses, and he's like growling, and he's got these tiny little man shorts on, which is really funny, and he's in leg press, and he sounds like he's having a baby. And he's doing some pec flies, and he's done some other things. And Metzer's just kind of like walking him through, like, slows contraction, never stop, don't lock the joints out. And he's just sort of walking the people through the basics of it. But it's up on YouTube, I'm sure. I use a handful of them. But you get classic Mike, too, where he's like, in his voice, and he's Mike Metzer, he's like, this is training intense. And he's, being all funny. So it's part comedy, which is part of my job, but solid information nonetheless.
Cool. What's the best way for people to find out more about you, see what you're up to, Andy?
Yeah, the podcast, of course, which is slowly released. It's just 9 episodes, so it's not like a weekly one or anything like that. My social media is at Dr. like Dr. Andy Galpin, mostly on Instagram, things like that. But you can find me everywhere there. Cool. And then.
I appreciate you doing this, Andy. And for everyone listening, for all the show notes, links and resources, for everything that's been mentioned, including the research papers, if I can find them, please go to corporatewarrior.org. And until next time, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Before you head off, head on over to corpwarrior.com to get your free ebook with 6 interview transcripts with some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Bill DeSimone, on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. These transcripts are not verbatim, deliberately. Instead, they've been transcribed in an easy read format to make it more enjoyable and easier for you to quickly pick out what you need and start getting results. To get your ebook, head on over to corpwarrior.com, that's CORP warrior.com, and enter your email address. Then check your email for an email from me with a confirmation link. Once you click the link, you'll be instantly redirected to a PDF version of the transcripts. This podcast is brought to you by HitUni.com. HitUni.com are a provider of amazing online courses for high-intensity training qualifications. HitUni comes highly recommended by the best in the field, including Body by Science co-author Dr. Doug McGuff, Discover Strength CEO Luke Carlson, and trainer and founder of Bay.com, Drew Bay. It was founded by my friend, author, and longtime personal trainer, Simon Shawcross, who's also been a guest on the podcast. Simon has 15 years experience training clients and has supervised over 15,000 high-intensity training workouts. Using knowledge from experts like Skylar Tanner, Dr. James Steele, Dr. Ellington Darden, HitUni is a goldmine for learning everything to do with high-intensity training. The courses are delivered online through the website, where you can learn via a variety of multimedia materials at your own pace. There's online support and a discussion forum where you can share ideas and ask for help. To learn more about high-intensity training and improve my own results, I started their personal trainer course. The content is amazing, the courses are really easy to follow, and each section is organized into bite-sized chunks that give you a real sense of achievement after you complete each one. I should also mention there is a DIY course, so this is the course for you if you're not necessarily a personal trainer, but you want to learn more about high-intensity training and how to implement it for maximum benefit in your own exercise regime. To get your exclusive Corporate Warrior 10% discount on any course you purchase, simply head on over to hituni.com, that's HITUNI.com, and enter the coupon code CW10, that's CW and the number 10. So again, head on over to hituni.com, pick your course, and enter the coupon code CW10 for 10% discount. Thank you for your support.